I just had this vision in mind, and it just was so glowy and it just warm, and it like made me feel glowy and warm that there's a chance that I could build this thing and have these feelings and reconnect with my family and have this happy ending. And then I built this business, and there's orders that come in now, and there's a lot of expectation, and there's farmers that call me up and are like, I need to offload these raspberries. And so now it's like the relationships that push me at this point.
A movement is underway of people abandoning the emotional, physical, and financial expenses of city living and crafting their own purpose, livelihoods, and joy in the rural reaches. The Urban Exodus podcast shares the wisdom, wit, and stories of those who decided to embark on the road less traveled, to pursue their own interpretation of the good life. Small business owners, change makers, artists, farmers, and more, working towards building a better future for themselves and their fellow citizens. This podcast is for country dreamers, rural folk, and urban dwellers alike who want to feel more connected to the natural world and the purpose and choices in their lives. I'm Melissa Hessler. Welcome to the Urban Exodus. I'm excited to invite you to my conversation with V Smiley, the person behind V Smiley Preserves, a honey-based jams, savory preserves, and marmalades business. V was born on a farm in rural Vermont, a child of Back to the Landers. Some of V's fondest childhood memories are sitting around the table enjoying delicious meals grown on their farm. In their early 20s, V came out as queer, and it was not well received, especially by V's father. Feeling unwelcome to return home, V moved to the West Coast and started working in restaurants. The pace and culture of the work was intense, and when V had an opportunity to make preserves for a seasonal fine dining restaurant, which had a different skill set, pace, and hours, V jumped at the chance. Thus began V's mastery and passion for preserves. V Smiley Preserves was built in Seattle, but with the full intent to eventually move that business back to V's childhood home and farm in Vermont. This is a story of homecoming, careful and intentional planning, legacy, perseverance, and preserves. I hope you enjoy it. I am really excited to be speaking with V Smiley today. I met you and your partner, Amy, was that like back in maybe 2018?
That sounds about right.
I feel like we're in a time warp now, so all time is relative. I have no idea. But I came and visited your farm, and I met you and Amy, and we had really great conversations, and I heard your story, and it's just a really hard, beautiful, and inspiring story about homecoming and about overcoming really, really hard parts of your life and kind of healing yourself in those capacities. And so I'm really excited about the business that you've built. I love your preserves. I eat them all the time. I've recommended V Smiley Preserves to so many people, and then they'll like text me and be like, I'm never having another jam. I'm never getting any other jam ever again. Thank you so much. So I've never really experienced that with products like that. So anyways, I digress. It's great to have you on the show. I'm really excited to speak with you again. And I guess first off, I'd love for you to share a little bit of your personal backstory, where you grew up, how it shaped you, how you met your partner, all that good stuff.
So I grew up in New Haven, Vermont, on a 150-acre farm in Addison County, which is on the western side of the state. My parents were back to the landers, so folks that moved out of cities, suburbs, into rural places in the early 70s for the most part. But thousands of people came to the state of Vermont, for instance, and tried to figure out how to farm. There was a moment in time, my parents were a part of it, and they initially bought this piece of land with another couple, and that partnership was pretty short-lived. as I've come to discover over the last decade, actually, my parents came from a fair amount of privilege and were able to avail themselves of enough funds to buy out those partners and become the sole owners of this piece of land, again in the 70s. And I was born in the 80s, and I am the youngest. And all of my siblings, there's 4 kids, and all of us are about 4 or 5 years apart. So we really had generational differences in that have to do with where my parents were at in their journey on how they wanted to live on this piece of land and be residents and citizens. My dad was very political, and so we went from baking bread to like eating McDonald's. We had there was a big journey, kind of, I'd say, mostly related to exhaustion and working on this piece of land and just various troubles. So as the youngest, I sort of both saw the beginning of my life. We were still doing commercial vegetable farming and had a herd of Angus beef, but my father was older. And so in my teens, at the very beginning of my teens, there was a big change that happened. The herd was sold, and we went from heating and cooking completely with wood, and we got central heat, and we got a gas stove, and the herd was gone, and we were no longer responsible for growing much of our food. Like, we started buying lettuce in the winter. So that happened when I was a high schooler. So, but my siblings have a pretty different experience. So I did have those like 7 or so years where my summer, I was also homeschooled until I was 10. So, and school started late in the fall, and it ended early in the spring so that we could plant out food. And so I saw that at the beginning of my life, and then that sort of started to wane when I was about 10 or 11. But, lots of food, growing food. And then my mom also worked in the food industry. She was an ingredients buyer for Earth's Best baby food. So she traveled around the world looking for organic ingredients for this baby food that was a part of the natural foods movement that was happening in the late 80s. So I was pretty steeped in it. And my mom has stayed in agriculture to one degree or another, up right through now. I mean, it's her job, or she does a ton of volunteer work. And every year she calls around to hundreds of area farmers and producers and helps put together this guide that a local organization publishes every year, detailing all the folks making and growing local food. So that's just one way in which she's still involved.
That's amazing. I didn't actually know all of that backstory. Have you ever watched the movie Baby Boomer?
I have not.
When you brought up the baby food company as part of the local food
is that
movement,
with Diane Keaton?
With Diane Keaton, I wondered if it was based on a true story.
It is. It is very much based upon Earth's Best baby food, I believe.
Interesting. Okay, sorry, that was a digression. I digress.
But it was 2 brothers. It was 2 brothers who started Earth's Best baby food, Arnie and Ron Koss, I think.
So that must have been really interesting to kind of go from, your siblings' experience is so different than what yours is, from going from no central heating, just having wood, really being like a back to the lander child, and then kind of transitioning to this other way of living. What was that transition like for you?
I remember being kind of excited at the time. I mean, I was homeschooled until I was 10, and then I made this abrupt change into being in private Catholic school when I was 10 years old, and it was brutal on a social level. I mean, I didn't have TV, and so it was awful. It was an awful transition, and there was no real support for it. I was excited to modernize in any way possible.
Were you raised religious before then? What was it like to go to a Catholic school?
I was raised by an atheist father, and my mom left the Catholic Church, I think, in her late teens, early 20s. And I certainly grew up with a very strong sense of consciousness around religion. For whatever reason, reading the Bible and then the Quran was a part of our homeschooling. So even before I started technically being homeschooled, I started about age 4 with my dad. But before that, I mean, I was just there while my siblings were being homeschooled, and I would hang out underneath the kitchen table, which is sort of where all the homeschooling happened. And the day started either with shape note singing often, or we'd start by reading the Bible. I don't know where my dad got this idea, but some of my earliest memories are like sitting underneath the kitchen table listening to my dad read the Bible that he did not believe in at all. I mean, it was being treated as a text, but it was a searing story to her to hear told. I was especially struck by Revelation. I just remember thinking, this seems really mean. And then I remember being struck when we read the Quran. It was like the beginning part was just over and over again. I remember hearing, there is no other God, there is no other God. And we had just come off of reading the Bible, and my little brain was just like, I don't get it.
Absolutely. Well, and it's interesting if your father was a self-proclaimed atheist, that he would want to kind of have that foundation set at a young age, or at least to like think about those things.
Yeah. So, I mean, I struggled so much when I transitioned into Catholic school that, for one thing, I was going to mass at least once a week, and, not receiving communion. And that was just one way in which I was feeling excluded from the whole experience that I was having up there. I was in so much pain. I was really strongly contemplating converting to Catholicism at that age. And my grandmother, my mom's mom, was so thrilled and got so excited. Oh, I feel terrible thinking back on it now. But I mean, I'm sure I was just experiencing trauma and was trying to deal with it. And I was like, well, at least I can take that darn communion when I'm there and like be a part of this community. So, but yeah, I didn't convert. And my dad would always just say like, well, I don't believe in this, but man, I wish I did, because our life would be so much simpler if I could just 100% impart all these values and believe in them and like inculcate you in this world. I mean, in part because we were already looking forward to our struggles around my being queer. And I mean, I was already fighting him about that when I was 10 and 11 years old, because there was discussion starting to happen around gay marriage in our country. And I was like fierce about it and really, and then he was very fierce back. There was a day, and I think I must have been like 11 or so. And I got into this argument over the breakfast table before heading off to school with my dad about gay marriage. And I remember because my brother was the one driving us to school at that point. So he would have been 16. So maybe it was more like going into 7th grade. Anyway, I just remember I got in a fight with my dad about it, and I was defending people's right to gay marriage. And he was so upset. And he was like, I'm going to keep you home from school unless you basically recant. And I was like, I don't want to stay home. So sure, whatever, just let me go.
Let's walk back a little bit, because I know that you coming out to your parents was a very painful experience, and your father's reaction to it kind of pushed you out of the home and away from home and on this other path. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I want to be clear. I never was pushed out of the home on a physical level. I very purposefully waited until I was physically outside the home to formally come out to my parents. I mean, I recognized that I wasn't straight in my teens. I always say, there's many coming outs, and for someone, and you can do it in stages. And the last stage for me was doing it with my parents. And while I was out to family and friends, I wasn't out to my parents. And somehow also my community and my siblings, they protected me, and no one told my parents. I mean, I think my parents knew. So I didn't formally come out to them until I was 20, and I was actually living abroad. I was doing a study abroad in Norway, and they came and visited me. It was a week-long visit, and I just remember I had to go to the bathroom all the time because I was so anxious, because I knew at the end of the week, just before they left, I was going to do this thing. And my dad at some point was just like, what? He's like, you do not seem well. He's like, do we need to do something for you? Like, what's going on? And we went up to this lake up above the city of Oslo so I could show that spot to them. And that's the last train stop or last subway stop of one of the lines of the T-Bahn in Oslo. And I knew that if I came out to them, we could do it there, and then they would just get on the subway and then just have to go back to their place. So that's what we did. And yeah, the words were spoken, and they were just like there wasn't much said. And then they just got on the subway and left. And I think I got my first note on a postcard of one of the Norwegian royal family. It was a picture of the Norwegian royal family on a postcard, like some young princess. And on the back was a very threatening note from my dad. I think he had bought it in the airport on his way out of Oslo. And he was just saying, like, don't do this. Don't do this. And then a couple of days passed, and I received this very long letter from him, which was which was the impetus for me ending our relationship at that time. It's sort of like a manifesto of like how my dad's brain worked. I sort of appreciated it at the time because it was sort of like laying it all out, like the ways in which it doesn't make sense. It was very,
it was like almost seeing his like brain synapses firing.
Yeah, and it was contradictory. It was like on the one hand, I was just sort of this piece of meat, A lot of it centered around my partner at the time. I was dating the person who had been my high school girlfriend. I was now dating them again, and they were in the process of transitioning or coming out as trans, and they're super smart and physically gifted and super athletic. Anyway, and just in this, my dad was both like, "You're too beautiful for this person," and then he was also like, "You're not smart enough for this person," really displaying this sort of ugly dichotomy that lived in him. Anyway, it made it really clear. I was like, there's just nothing here. There's just nothing good here. And even like the goodness, which is the love, like my dad really loved me or whatever, some version of me that he made up in his brain. It was very toxic. So it just didn't make sense to be in relationship to it. And so, yeah, that was a formal severing for me. And I became estranged for a couple of years from my parents. There was a brief moment because I was still in college. There was a question of whether or not they would maintain their section of my funding of school. They did. I was really worried about it because my partner at the time was also struggling with their parents about keeping college funding. And we both had parents that came through for us on that end, but they did want me to come home and do what sounded like conversion therapy to me. So I definitely didn't do that. And I didn't come home again for a couple of years, basically until I met Amy years later. So, but at that point, it kind of more turned into how I was going to, or if I was going to be in relationship to my mom. So we didn't talk really hardly at all for the first couple of years. And then slowly she kind of came back into my life for a number of reasons that, things really changed because my dad, again, he was older. He had a massive stroke and was sort of debilitated by that. So that really changed our family dynamic a lot.
I know your father has passed now. Was there any point of reconnection with him, any sort of bearing of things, or did he leave this world with this severing?
He left the world with the severing.
Oh, that's so hard. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, and it's so I'm working on this project that is the brick and mortar location of V Smiley Preserves and follows through on this long process of building this brand so that I could move back to the farm where I grew up and build a life here and be the next generation on this farm and keep the farm in use and sort of connect all these dots and rebuild this relationship with my mom. There's been the whole business side of that. And then there's been the emotional side of it. I mean, and like the two are interconnected for me. Why? The reason I'm doing the business is because of the emotional side of it. But yeah, there's a lot of that time period in my early 20s that I just hadn't really, I was like, well, yeah, it's really sad. But it was in the process of putting together all the materials that went with our crowdfund that we ran earlier this summer that just, really has caused a confrontation with the pain of that time. I mean, which is positive. So yeah, I mean, in doing this work of sort of trying to expand V Smiley Preserves and do it with this very personal story, of course, it brings along my family with it, which is complicated and not always easy for them. Of course, there's my mom who's always having her husband talked about in a certain way. And then there's my siblings, and it's not just just not like, oh, V moved back to Vermont from the West Coast and, it's all just turning out well. It's obviously more complicated than that. So it takes a lot of work. I mean, just to be straight up, there's a lot of therapy happening.
It's beautiful that you can kind of combine that into like this livelihood, this legacy that you want to create, like trying to replant some good seeds in a place where you've probably had a lot of really great memories, but then this kind of really hard piece as well. And so kind of mending in your own way.
Right. And the memories are so centered on food. Like it's always, we had all these meals together and we had all these delicious flavors happening at a rhythm through those meals and then getting to grow that, so a lot of it, like the positive, the bright spots really center around food and flavor. And so that's why I've come back to that. That's why I work in food, because those are the bright spots for sure.
You worked in the restaurant industry for many years before starting V Smiley Preserves. I'd love to hear what that experience was like for you and any improvements that you think could be implemented to make that industry better.
Yeah, I am today thinking about that from the perspective of now being an employer and thinking about how I'm approaching the folks that I work with and realizing that I feel like such a cusper in terms of, or I guess I'll say this, I think I'm realizing now I am more inculcated into sort of the traditional restaurant system than I maybe thought I was, than I would have said I was a year ago, now that I'm responsible for other folks. And I think about my mindset. It's like so I'm thinking about it very actively. What do I like about how I was trained through restaurants? What I like about it, what I would keep, and what I want to dispose of.
That's hard. That's thinking about like kind of, evolution of systems. So you have to be a very active participant in that process.
Well, there's so much self-reliance that is taught in the sort of traditional restaurant system. Like you're very alone. I mean, the kind of the classic example is being a line cook and coming in. I mean, I worked mostly in places that didn't have prep cooks. So you showed up and you were responsible for a certain amount of work and you had to be ready by such and such a time. And your boss is a professional and hopefully the menu's been set up in a way where you really can accomplish that. And your skill set and the menu and it is all coming together in a way that it's like created a workflow that is physically doable for you in that a certain amount of time. But it's terrifying. Like, am I going to get this done in time? And then there's so much pressure to not ask for help, or at least I felt that way. Anyway, so the whole system teaches you such self-reliance. And that's really cool on one level. I mean, and it comes down to like, you build these kits full of tools and you have all these knives maybe, and, it can expand into like spoons and ridiculousness. And I've been thinking about like the simpleness of your tools and how to approach what I want an employee to come to their job with and what's really fair. Like I just automatically come in like, you are working as a cook, you're going to be chopping up these things. I had to provide my own set of knives. I built them up gradually. I observed someone needed bench scrapers. I got my own bench scraper. And I built that. I just looked, no one ever told me I really had to have those things. I just looked around and I was like, oh, this is the culture and I'm going to recreate it and fall in line. But then I'm like, that's also crazy. Why should every person have to show up with these tools and spend all this money? Like,
I didn't even know that was the case in the restaurant industry until you just said that, actually.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a tiny little thing, but I even think about like the ethics of like, wanting or requiring, which I don't require it, but it just like, oh, like I have these expectations and then I sort of feel disappointed if someone's not mimicking the culture, and yet that doesn't really make any sense. It really doesn't make any sense. Why can't I just as an employer supply all of those things? So just a tiny example, but there's many, many versions of that. It also comes up around like time off, I mean, there's just so much about like, yeah. So just realizing, wow, I came up in this industry and I did change a lot internally to make it work. And I'm not to the level of like, I went through this, so you have to go through this. I don't believe that, but I feel I went through this and I feel stronger or somehow more nimble or like tougher for it. But then there's like, well, who says you have to be tough? I think what it does come down to is like, okay, so we have like, it's food. People don't want to pay a lot of money for food. We have a finite amount of time. it's a question, how finite is the money? How much can we ask for a product? How much can we charge for this plate of food? And trying to get it done in that certain amount of time. And there's just, you can squeeze and squeeze and squeeze and squeeze. And it's trying to find this balance of like, people gain skills as they do something. And it's like finding, it's a very classic, how do you lay the runway for someone to grow and to kind of do that natural growth cycle of just building skills and getting a little bit faster and becoming more efficient, and so that they can evolve and take on more responsibility or do other parts of the job, and having that be organic and follow a course that mirrors like what they want to do with their body and their lives, and also fulfills the needs of the business, and having that somehow mesh also with the financial part. But then constantly wondering like, well, can we push the financial part more?
Calling all small and rurally based business owners. Do you love Urban Exodus and want to help support our continued programming? Become a founding partner of the new Urban Exodus shop. You can reach an engaged customer base who believes in supporting farmers, makers, artisans, and small business owners in rural economies. We are looking for culinary delights, home goods, body goods, art, textiles, adornments, more. We just are really interested to see what you're creating and try to help you get it out there to a larger audience. And we're looking for vendors who make quality products, who pay a living wage, and who run sustainably minded operations. And if this sounds like you and your business and you want to learn more, please click the partnerships page on urbanexodus.com. It's a really delicate balance, right? And now that you've kind of seen both sides of it as both an employee and now a boss, and the margins are slim in a lot of food related businesses. And so trying to figure out, on the scale, where you put your finger on the scale, what things you prioritize so that all those things line up, that would be really hard. Yeah, I appreciate that you are not just cognizant of it, but like really actively thinking about it, because I think that that's when the best like small changes can be made to improve industries and improve like culture, right? Workplace culture.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, I'm just a little baby in the process.
We're talking about the restaurant industry. I'd love to hear the founder story of V Smiley Preserves and, how it was born and what roles you and your partner, Amy, each fill in your professional lives.
Yeah, I met Amy on Whidbey Island, which is in the Puget Sound, so not far from Seattle, Washington. And I moved up to Whidbey because I was working at an art residency there called Hedgebrook. I had already started cooking professionally in Los Angeles and was already thinking about this piece of land. Very much, I don't think I was conscious of it at the time, but I wanted to come home, right? So I basically, on a very like big level, like I feel like I got cast out. I think what we didn't kind of say earlier was that my dad was basically like, in your current form. I mean, number one, it was like, wow, he really hates women. And number two, he's like, you literally told me you're dead because you're gay and I just cannot accept you. So I felt cast out. And so from my early 20s, I began to think about like, how can I go home? How can I go home? And so in my early 20s, I was thinking about this piece of land, and I was still working in the arts at that time. And so I got the idea of like, oh, we could turn this place the farm into an art residency one time. So that's how I ended up at Hedgebrook, was to start learning the quote unquote business of art residencies. And Hedgebrook was cool because they really focused on food as a way of opening up space for creativity, especially for women. Anyway, so that's what got me onto Whidbey, and I met Amy, and we actually decided to move into Seattle together. Amy had lived there for years, off and on. It was new for me, and it was a big deal to go back into a city after living in Los Angeles. And that's when I got really serious about cooking and started cooking in, I guess I wasn't working in traditional fine dining, but kind of fancy restaurants. I was actively thinking the whole time about the farm and just trying to skill build this general idea of want to end up back in Vermont on this piece of land. I want to cook for my community. How am I going to do that? I have to learn about business, have to learn how to cook, just need to sponge it up. And restaurants were a tough fit for me. They seemed kind of mean and super hierarchical, and They were definitely uncomfortable, but I was at spaces that were trying to be better and were certainly really beautiful and making beautiful food. It was super inspiring. And I happened to work for people that were very interested in preserves, which is an offshoot of if you're cooking seasonally, usually thinking of preserving in some kind of way. So I began to get really into making preserves of all kinds, working at this restaurant called Sitka and Spruce, in part too, because it has a different sort of time frame to it than line cooking, for instance, that like show up at 1 o'clock and get ready for service. It just had an inherently different timeline to it that kind of pushed against that urgency of the daily service. So I liked that. And then I loved that I could go home and just work on it like crazy at home. So I was canning a lot at home, and then I was canning as much as I could at the restaurant. Eventually I was given a day to just do canning for the family of restaurants, and diving into that deep is what really opened up all these questions for me, because I wasn't achieving the looks of the recipes that I was seeing in these cookbooks. And I left restaurants kind of out of discomfort and went to work for Theo Chocolate, and at the same time started volunteering because I was so anxiously wanting to keep skill building. And I found this book by Rachel Saunders called The Blue Chair. I always forget the actual name of it, but her name was the Blue Chair Jam Company. And she has a cookbook, and it was sort of the answer to all these questions that had been created. And I started taking classes with her or volunteering at her classes. And it began to form in my mind that I could potentially start a company here in Seattle and start building a brand while I was still on the West Coast, and learn and use it to learn about business. And that at the same time, I'd be building this thing that I could take with me, so that one day, whatever I ended up doing in Vermont, I would already have somewhat of a customer base. I actually went back to work at restaurants, and I ended up somewhere that was really supportive of that. And I was able to both work at that restaurant and start the jam company at the same time. So I concurrently was doing farmers market, doing production, and also line cooking at the Whale Winds. And just as I got that job, my father had passed away. That completely altered the landscape for me. It opened up Vermont, and I could finally come home here. And so I put 2 years into operating V Smiley Preserves in Seattle, but knowing the whole time that we were going to move the business back here, but wanting to always have that connection to these spaces that I worked in Seattle, so that when we again someday opened here in Vermont, the folks that I had connected with out west would feel connected to this place in Vermont too. I've been thinking about building a destination here for a decade at this point, and I knew that was going to be really hard, and so I wanted to sort of tether into the West Coast, and starting a brand out there was a way to do that, I thought.
This is another reason why I love your story, V, because I think a lot of people don't actively plan as much as you do. You manifested this. You actively planned your future escape and built a business so that you could move with it. And it wouldn't be I think that sometimes people feel like, oh, I'm building this business, and if I move, I lose all my clients, or I lose all of my
Well, that did happen.
Things. But probably have some of those customers come back.
I mean, what's so funny is literally the Whale Winds just placed a jam order last week.
There it is, right? That's the proving of what your method was to get home. What was the homecoming like for you when you got back to New Haven? And have you been able to mend any of those, kind of hard relationships that you had since leaving?
It was a little messy. There's an apartment next door to my mom's home, which is where Amy and I live, and we're slated to move in here, but in between another family member needed to spend some time here and then wasn't able to leave kind of at the same time that Amy and I were showing up. So we actually ended up moving in with my mom for the first 9 months of being back here in Vermont. So that's real cozy. But I think it's good because it sort of gave us this crash course in getting to know each other. I mean, it was just immediate built-in intimacy, sharing meals. And it also, it brought up so much. I mean, also immediately we were thinking about then this apartment, and that became the place we were going to live, was also turning into a conversation about the values that Amy and I have, and how we were coming in real hot from living in the city, or that's how it felt to my mom. And I mean, it's just a big old getting to know each other time, which is what needed to happen. And there's stuff underneath the surface that needed to be on the surface. And so it was a time of discovery. And I mean, it's ongoing still. And I think there's just certain things that we've kind of backed away from. Like when we first showed up here, we would have these big, grand conversations and dreaming and, oh, we'll build this here and we can do this together. I mean, I remember sitting in a place with my mom and I'd be like, yeah, I really see you as like the chief operating officer and I'm the CEO. And I mean, that's not what's happened. I think too, as my mom, I mean, we do therapy together and now, and she was saying a couple months ago that it's kind of a relief that I ended up not wanting to build a facility here on the farm for V Smiley Preserves. It just kind of makes more sense. It just creates a lot of pressure to put that on the farm. So, as I think my mom is also, she's just really enjoyed being the boss here of this 150 acre piece of land and making the decisions about forest plans and what to do in this section. And she didn't, because she had to sublimate her feelings so much to be with my dad. And so now she's getting to do what she wants. And so I think I can meanwhile be elsewhere and be in relationship to this place and live here and be in relationship to her and be laying the groundwork for the future. So we're in a good financial position to live here and pay the taxes and get some ingredients from this piece of land, but to not just pile it all on at the same time. And she can be independent and do her thing. And so that's where we're at currently.
I'd love for you to talk about kind of your newest ambition, which is the building of the mini factory, and kind of your future vision for V Smiley Preserves and your thoughts on the importance of strengthening rural economies through focused entrepreneurship.
The number one thing I always come back to thinking about is the limited number of spaces. It's really a question of real estate here. There's so few places. I mean, there's lots of zoning restrictions when you're in a rural place, and towns have different approaches. Some towns still don't have zoning, but by and large, the idea here is that we want all economic activity to be on Main Street. Main Streets are very short here. They're small. And then town to town, things kind of change a little bit how they deal with that, like radius around the immediate town. And then the rural area is supposed to stay rural. And if you're going to do some kind of commercial enterprise in a rural area, like on this farm, you need to be deriving 50%, or I believe using, it's like 50% of your inputs have to be coming from the farm. I can't remember the exact language. Basically, the idea is that you're using this piece of land for agricultural use, and that's quickly going into some kind of product or experience. But they want it to be real. I mean, what these towns are trying to make sure doesn't happen is that they have, for instance, these wedding barns. But obviously, at the same time, there are these economic realities. So the people do all kinds of creative things. But in terms of V Smiley Preserves, probably since 2018, I started looking for the next place for V Smiley Preserves to be. We work out of a shared commissary kitchen right in downtown Bristol, and I share the space with two other people who are my landlords. They're partners on it, and then I'm the tenant. And we all run very seasonal businesses. All of us have our high seasons in the summer, so it's tight. And I would say we probably really solidly outgrew that space a year ago, and we're still making it work. Everyone's making it work. My landlords are. So then it's like, okay, we've grown to a certain size. Where do we go next? And the next spot has been really elusive to find. So I was just reading about someone down in Philadelphia, a project down there, the Honeysuckle Project, I think is what it's called. Anyway, they're having the same, they've had multiple business partnership things fall apart, buildings have been bought on sort of our behalf, and then it doesn't work out. We don't become the tenants. I mean, they rent out the space. It's okay. But I mean, we were looking for a space that has a ventilation system so we can make jam and there's some frontage, and we can also receive freight in some way, even if that means getting pallets of glass and moving them inside. Like I'm open to a lot of scenarios. But a year and a half ago, this brand called Shaksbury Cider approached me. They have a big space in a town nearby, and we began talking about putting in a restaurant space and a production space for V Smiley Preserves. The goal has always been to run a restaurant for me, is to cook for people, And the jam company was really started because I love fruit, and also because it's a message in a jar that can go across the country and get people to come to Vermont and eat this food that we made and experience Vermont and come to a rural place and spend their money here. So this space that we were going to build in Vergennes is meant to be this very experiential production space. It's the space is almost 3,500 square feet, and it's set up in a way where if you need to use the facilities, you walk the entire space. And so it's a natural fit for taking someone inside the entire process of what V Smiley Preserves does. And then it had this frontage as well. So we can operate as a coffee shop and use the food menu and the drink menu to show all the places that preserves make sense on the plate. Because we don't really have a huge tradition around preserves and preserve use here in the United States. It's much stronger in like England or France or even Northern Europe, for instance. And so I want to use the menu to make the case for fruit preserves in everyday cooking and eating. And at the same time, take people inside of kind of a small food producer business. And what we do is so visually beautiful and just lovely for the senses, all the colors of the fruit and the smells. And we work in these copper pans, and people always comment when they visit us in our kitchen, like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. And so I wanted to expand that experience for people.
It is so beautiful. I'm thinking of these, like the colors, like the jewel tone colors of the preserves that you make, and just our photo shoot inside your existing space. So it's basically like a museum of sorts on the preserves process and actually enjoying them in a number of different ways.
Yeah. And it's so exciting too. I mean, we've had a really good tree fruit year this year, and I feel so much pride about how much local produce that we're bringing in this year. We've almost doubled how much we're buying locally. So that feels really good. And they're pretty, I mean, some of them are pretty like close relationships, you know? I mean, even to the point when someone writes me and says I have this fruit and I can't take it. I mean, I feel terrible. I'm like, oh, I just don't have the room right now. Or it's coming in the wrong time of the week and we don't have the labor to process it. So I have to turn them down. Yeah. Don't want that stuff to go to waste. I mean, because every year is so different. You're like, oh man, it is a good year this year. And it hasn't been good the last couple of years. So
that's so interesting because, yeah, if you're going to be trying to source locally, right, as much as possible, you almost have to be creative and flexible with your recipes to a certain degree, because of like what comes in that year.
Well, that stuff has already fortunately happened when I was at a smaller scale. Like I've built these recipes to absorb, and I have enough recipes and I can absorb a really variable fruit season. So we're pretty resilient to whatever happens. And obviously these seasonal changes have more of an impact the bigger you get. So it's nice to have done a lot of that discovery when we were smaller.
Has your mom helped at all? I mean, this is kind of what your mom was doing, right? Sourcing ingredients from organic farms. As far as like sourcing your produce, is she actively helping you in that way, or are you taking a lot of that on your own?
Well, I fully inherited, if it's a gene, I have it. It's one of my favorite parts of the job is the sourcing and the relationships. I relish that part of the work. I mean, it does happen with my mom, and she does this guide of all the local producers. So she'll be like, hey, they got some currants planted and they need a home for them. So I do sort of the sort of smaller scale type buying that I do from more of just homesteaders will take place often because of her community connections, because she's more in the community on a day-to-day level.
I really believe that a rising tide can lift all boats. And that's what V Smiley Preserves is trying to do. You know, you're trying to create more rural economic opportunities by planting permanent roots in your community. What does it mean to you to return to your hometown specifically and create more economic opportunities here?
When I first moved back here, I was working at a restaurant in Burlington, and I grew up commuting to Burlington for school for 8 years. So I thought it wasn't going to be that big of a deal to have to drive up 50, 55 minutes to work, but I hated it. And I mean, the whole point of moving back here was to be in the place where I grew up as much as possible. So it just made no sense. And when you want to go out to eat here, a lot of the time people go to Burlington, which is our big city here in Vermont, which is tiny. I mean, it's 40, 50,000 people, but that's sort of, if you want a certain experience, you go there, and that's fine. Again, I feel like a cusper. I mean, in terms of, I am fully prepared to respect the traditions of being a little bit further out and sort of what's expected and required as part of living out here. Folks don't like out of towners bowling in here and just doing, I mean, yeah, no one likes a carpetbagger in a rural community. That is so real.
Having grown up in that community, have you felt less of that sense, or do you still feel that pressure?
I do feel that pressure. I do feel, yeah, because there's a lot of class stuff going on as well. And I don't want people to feel excluded, but I know how easy it is to feel excluded. And there are multiple Vermonts, and, there's a lot of people doing business who want to welcome as many people as possible. But there's all these signals that get sent that, means certain folks don't come in your door. So no, that's a huge part of living here and negotiating that.
I think it's also hard just to think about, how you kind of meet these standards that you want for yourself, that you want to be able to pay, you want to have a good work environment, pay a living wage to people, but then balancing that with making it affordable enough or accessible enough to your larger community as well, so that you don't feel like you're creating something that isn't for them.
Oh, yeah, that's it. And that's another huge thing. Yeah, certainly. The product I make is very expensive, but honestly, I just looked at another jam company who works in the same size jar that we do. And they just put their prices up. I think their minimum price now for that jar is $16. And then the more one-off type product is 18 or 20. That is what the product should cost.
That's that hard balance. And especially building something in a rural community, having grown up in that rural community, knowing your neighbors, knowing the people around you. I would imagine that there's a lot of kind of turmoil that you feel over trying to find, have that delicate balance.
Yeah. So people will think of, at the best, someone can think of V Smiley Preserves as a treat. So, and that's how a lot of the purchasing of our product happens, is that it's sort of a special occasion type purchase. Not for everyone. There are people, there's a lot, because we make honey sweetened jam without added pectin. It's a really simple, for a lot of folks, it's a really simple, easy to digest product. So we have people who just eat it because it's literally easier on their tummy. But yeah, so there's a lot packed into living here. And I feel it even more because certainly we've really, baseline come from a lot of privilege, even in the sense of knowing or being pretty sure that we're going to inherit this farm. That's crazy. It's a responsibility. But in the short term, there's a lot of hard work that's gone into being here, and a lot of, I just have worked a lot of part-time jobs being here. I didn't start doing V Smiley Preserves exclusively literally until 2020. I had part-time jobs up until I moved to Vermont in 2015, and I held part-time jobs up until 2020. Obviously the pandemic pushed. I qualified for financial help I was unemployed technically through one of my jobs. So like many people, I don't think a lot of people are talking. I've talked to other business owners. It was who were spanning that, both being business owners and also still working for other folks and deriving much of their income still from working for other people. And I know I'm not alone in being a business owner that was really helped by the rescue plans that were passed by Congress.
how can people continue to support the expansion and the kind of vision that you have for V Smiley Preserves in the future?
It is a wild moment for V Smiley Preserves. We ran this successful crowdfund earlier this summer, which was incredible. I'd been hoping that that connection to the West Coast was still there, that I've been talking about. And so, I've been talking to banks for months at this point and saying like, no, because they're like, you've laid out this forecast. You say you're going to do this amount of sales. How are you as a new business? Because the idea is to build this all new location. And that doesn't happen here a lot. Mostly it's legacy businesses that get sold or passed along in these small rural towns. So to build something new and to say like, I can get folks to come here is a big ask. And so the crowdfund was gratifying because people showed up, and it was from the various parts of my life, the time in Los Angeles, the time out in the Pacific Northwest, and then the folks that I knew growing up and the folks that I've met since moving back here, and people I met when I worked at Middlebury College as a catering server, and the people I landscaped with over the last 4 years. And so that was really positive. And we are now in, I think, month number 9 or so of literally trying to raise money from banks and various loan sources inside of a larger 1.5 year long process with Shaksbury of trying to get everything in place to be able to do this giant $500,000 project. And kind of just straight up have run out of time. Everyone, of course, is under financial pressures. And so my partner on the project has given me until the end of the month. There's no hard feelings there about that. My partner on the project being Shaksbury. There's no hard feelings about that from me. Everyone's been really patient. And it is a question of whether or not I'm going to be able to cross the finish line with the funding. So a lot of folks turn us down. It's been all no's up until this point. And the way it happens with these kinds of projects is it's a money stack. So you build, at least in our case, because we're doing restaurants, I think at least new restaurants often get built with friends and family money. Sometimes you can get bank loans. I actually thought the bank loan thing would be a little bit easier because I have some peers that have gotten bank loans. But it's crazy because it involves your parents putting up their house as collateral, or maybe we don't own a home, but some of my peers do own homes at this point and they use their home as collateral. That just means that basically, the most dramatic version of that is if your business fails, they could take, your home is there to be taken potentially. That really happens. It really gets to that point, but it's a really big deal. Anyway, so I have learned through this process that if you're raising something like $500,000, of course, it often comes from various sources. And when you're dealing with banks or various lending institutions, they all kind of work together. It's like, oh, well, if you get this person, or if you get these folks, these will come in. And if you have one piece fall apart, then you have to you're not exactly starting from scratch, but it sort of resets the cycle again. So even if I had like this line of credit lined up, that was based upon this one lender. That one lender said no. So the line of credit might happen, but it will take, I had to first find the next primary lender, get that going, and then loop back in that line of credit in that 2 or 3 week period that they take to do their thing as well. So this is why it takes so long, months and months and months, and now soon to be almost years.
I see like real potential for roadblocks if you don't have, generational family wealth.
Well, the truth is it doesn't happen, right? It doesn't happen. Or it happens on a much smaller scale, or you go into an established business. It is, I always think about it is really about ventilation systems and a 3-bay sink. Where are they?
I'm sure you've explored every funding option at this point. I'm sure you are so well versed on this, having tried to kind of do this grassroots effort. It would make more sense to me if there were grant programs out there. So if people were trying to rebuild rural communities, provide opportunities, local jobs, support the ecosystem of a rural economy, it would make sense that there would be really easy pathways as far as grant programs to kind of help.
On the one hand, I sort of respect this process. I get the question from bankers, is there an in-between step? You're like, is there an in-between step between you moving from a commissary kitchen to spending $500,000 on a build out? Like, is there an in-between step? And that seems very reasonable. And there is potentially, if you happen to, if there's there's like 4 towns that surround us. There's sort of a primary bakery or space that supports each one of those communities. It's a generational thing when those spaces open up. There's maybe a few other restaurants. There's obviously creativity around like, oh, you could use an existing space and I'll be here at night. But at this point, I don't think I can't ask I don't want to ask my employees to work at night. The options are very, very limited. But I do respect the idea, like the choices, your menu is very limited here. But then there are things that only happen and things you only learn by going through this process. So I'm not sure I entirely hate the process that this is. I mean, it's awful. And I think it's destructive. Like, I feel destroyed right now by it. But at the same time, it's taken me into contemplating a different menu that I never would have contemplated a year and a half ago.
Yeah, it's really made you think about all angles, right?
It has. And obviously I've learned also a lot about raising money, but I mean, just mostly from a lender's banking. I mean, there's all different ways you can go, but I've just been focused on banks. So yeah, should it be easier? I think the most problematic thing is the way that they assess, is the way that risk is assessed. And you have to have property of some kind to collateralize these loans. And so I think that's the most problematic part to me. I mean, obviously on a material level, it makes sense. Oh, what happens when we need to recover our funds? But obviously it really narrows down who can even approach this system. And I think about it, it is hard to keep track of, because if the requirement is to go slow, take your time, build slowly, like I'm like, well, I check those boxes. Like I've moved very slowly. But at the same time, I am taking this really aggressive move to building out an all new space. And that's where you kind of, this is a scenario I'm really only contemplating because I am in a rural place and there are so few facilities here.
I just wanted to give an enormous thank you to all of you listeners who have made contributions toward the production of this podcast. Every season, I spend about 100 hours preparing, writing, editing, interviewing, and distributing the podcast. And I have hard costs for my editor and for those hosting fees. And it really means so much to me that you find enough meaning and value in this podcast to pledge your support and to keep it going. And if you haven't had a chance to contribute, we've made it really easy for you. Just click the support button on the top of Urban Exodus website and pledge any amount that you like. Thank you again. I really couldn't continue to do this work without you. The part of this that, new budding entrepreneurs would probably love to learn from you about, who are in the food or value-added product space, is how to expand their customer base. Because honestly, you've done a really great job of expanding your customer base and reach beyond your community. Partially that was like starting it in Seattle and then moving there and kind of, it's the breadcrumbs of customers along the way. But do you have any advice for people who are maybe based in a rural community right now and they have a great product, but they don't know how to get it beyond the farmer's market?
I mean, I guess I'll just talk about what I did here. So I got here and couple things. One, I couldn't get into the local farmers markets that I felt like that were the best fit for V Smiley Preserves at that time. But at the same time, I also knew that, or I hoped to be doing this bigger venture at some point and to be pulling in visitors from out of state. So while I was also finding no space locally for myself, I also knew that I planned to head out of state anyway, because I wanted to build a client base that drew from sort of the New England and New York region generally, so that people would come visit us, like, because I always had this destination idea in mind, and knowing how hard that is, how crazy and how hard that is to build if you don't have a lot of capital that you're starting out with. So I just started by traveling out of state and doing all these shows in our area. So I went down to the Hudson Valley a lot. I went down to New York City, and I went to Boston, and I targeted wholesale accounts in that same region. And a couple of years ago, decided to essentially, instead of paying myself, I invested in PR. So I've been working with PR for a couple of years. I mean, I've paid myself so little from this business, often, to give you a sense, like maybe in the $12,000 zone for a couple of years, just simply so I could spend money on beautiful photography, beautiful graphics, public relations, experimenting with advertising, trying out various things that have big price tags, and then just hustling, working 12, 14-hour days, 7 days a week, and working other jobs on the side. So that's how I made my money. And then I could experiment and try all these things with my business and invest in more sort of higher price items that usually are larger, that are only available to a larger company. Like right now I work with a marketing consultant to sort of take over, have less of this, oh, I'm a small business owner doing all this stuff. No, to start getting away from that sooner rather than later. Moving in the direction of working with consultants to learn about what's going to bring more customers, more business to V Smiley Preserves. So instead, I've actively chosen for years to, instead of paying myself, invest in those experiments.
That's actually great advice, because I think that there's a tendency, especially if you don't have a lot of capital starting a business initially, to just try to do everything, even if it's stuff that you aren't necessarily good at or want to do. You aren't doing it the best that you could be doing it. And it's hard, obviously, to take that financial hit if you're going to be putting all of that money that you're making into consultants or people to help you in those areas of your business. But ultimately, that can have a lot of effect on your customer reach. And if you're starting something small from like a rural area, working that, call it a side hustle for a reason, right? It's how you can kind of slowly, steadily grow your business and not fail in the areas that you aren't good at. I think that's wonderful advice. Your tenacity to figure things out by doing is really commendable. And I wonder how you overcome feelings of fear when it comes to taking risks and trying new things.
Amy says that I hurl myself at stuff.
My partner says the same thing about me. He's like, you just keep on going, whatever.
Yeah. And I'm always like, I don't know. I guess because I really identify as pretty conservative and very risk averse. I definitely identify with sort of over preparing a little bit. So the idea of hurling. So I guess I'm a mixture of the two. I'm a hurler and a preparer. But yeah, I think of like the moments when you just sort of crash out, and for me, it's like, in those moments, I usually have to just come home, get in bed, and watch some TV for a little while. You just get to an overload point. So it isn't strength all the time, I would say, I'm particularly in the thick of like feeling of flagging energy right now. But I think the business has gotten to a point too. So initially, for the first half of what I've been doing, I've been at this almost, what is it? Well, I started in 2013, so 8 years. The first half of it, I just had this vision in mind, and it just was so glowy and it just warm, and it like made me feel glowy and warm that there's a chance that I could build this thing and have these feelings and reconnect with my family and have this happy ending. And then I built this business, and there's orders that come in now, and there's a lot of expectation, and there's farmers that call me up and are like, I need to offload these raspberries. And so now it's like the relationships that push me at this point, and to show up and to keep going. And the next layer is having employees, and it becomes a more layered piece of lasagna. I mean, I don't know. It's not a positive way to think about it, but I don't want to do harm. So I think, my next, I got to figure out what's the positive way of saying that. But I mean, that's just the nature of the first half was like this glowy, delicious vision. And then you begin to build it. And then things just sort of start to cook and they take off. And then you're responsible to this thing. So that's the part I'm at now.
Well, I mean, you add all of that to the last 2 years, basically. We're nearly 2 years into this pandemic. And beyond the pandemic, there's just so many other things happening right now in the world. And it feels so extremely difficult just on a day-to-day basis. Even if you have all of your basic needs met and you feel extremely grateful for that. I was wondering what this time in history has taught you and how you are carrying any of those lessons into your work and intention for the future.
Yeah, I think about it from a perspective of learning what people are like and how, I think immediately of social media and seeing how people respond to the news and how do people respond to a moment in time, like George Floyd being killed, then thinking about how we live amongst each other, like we're in relationship to those people who are also you're experiencing on social media. And then like, oh, how does this tie into like living on River Road in New Haven, Vermont? Just this constant, I think what a lot of it boils down to is this like, oh, am I safe? Are we safe? Can I trust my neighbors? Are we headed in the right direction? Are people being reasonable? It's really confusing to keep track of. I really struggle mentally on when we kind of open up broadly like that. It's why it's so important for me to have the physical work of making jam and working with fruit and having that finite, concrete action. And then doing that work also eases my brain and lets me relax and kind of lets me dream. I tend to get pretty darn confused when I think more broadly. So yeah, I'm so focused in on it, like, okay, how can I pay people as much as possible and keep building, but also question growth. One of the things we started doing in the last year and a half is raising money every month for organizations. I have mixed feelings about that. I started doing it in part because I was like, well, I work on my business every single day and just do that and then come home and like watch basketball and talk to Amy and eat dinner. And that's all I do at this time in my life. So I literally and I don't have any money to give independently. So I was like, I need to use the business to do this because this is where I am. So we started doing that, but then I'm aware that it is marketing. I mean, literally I noticed in QuickBooks, I was like, wow, this is getting put under marketing. I think about, it is changed the way I live in this state or look at the state where I live, whereas I just didn't even know about some of these organizations that were here and doing work. Like there's an organization that connects new Americans with land, and I didn't even know about that organization. So I'm really happy to gain that knowledge and I'd like to put money in that direction. So those are little things you can do.
I was wondering if we could kind of leave the conversation with a legacy question, which is always a really big question. But I know that you felt called back because of that land, the land that you grew up on. I'm wondering what legacy, if you were to really look big picture into the future, what that vision is for the future and the legacy that you want to leave behind for your family and for future generations.
Yeah, for now, I'm fixated on this transition from my parents. That's at this point my mom, but I mean, she's also, I know, still, internally in dialogue with my father and what they wanted to do here. I think a lot about that transition from her to us, and by us, I mean Amy and I, but this is the home for all my siblings. So I have 3 siblings. So by taking care of this land, say 20 years from now, you're also taking care of our sort of collective home because we all grew up here. Some of my other siblings were actually literally born here like I was. But I think on just a simple level, like we want to feel good or as good as possible. And I'm trying to re-landscape this place and have good, positive memory take place here and experience. One thing that I love that Amy talks about is kind of thinking about this more as a trail system and having folks be able to come visit and walk on this land. I think there's this place called Shelburne Farms a little bit north of us, and people love to walk there. I mean, we don't have Lake Champlain to look out onto, but as like a space for being outdoors. I love that idea. Down the road, I'm not a farmer, and Amy's not interested in large scale farming, but there's some really good soil here. And I would love for there to be, and I know property is such an issue for young farmers who do have the energy to grow food. And I would like to open this place up to them. That has always been the dream, is to open this place up to others. I just felt like the way to really do that in a sustainable way was to build this very strong brand first and to build the sort of interpersonal business skills that made it possible to grow an organization here that could be pretty formal and actually last and not be sort of so relying upon someone's personal energy or vision. But I think so the more time that you can kind of hang out and build awareness or, be present as a brand, and just the sturdier that you can become, I think I'm hoping that more resources open up to us, that we meet more people. And so I'm just sort of, on a certain level, I'm just here hanging out, doing what I like and trying to be here long enough to be open to the future. And also do this very personal work of like getting to come home and have a positive experience and get to know my mom as deeply as possible so that I feel like I'm honoring her even when she's gone.
That would be such a beautiful ending to such kind of a hard story, a hard chapter. But, obviously it's very layered for you, returning back, building, finding that legacy. But I think it's a really beautiful vision for the future. And I am rooting for you. And I know that you can do it, even though it feels like you are in the weeds constantly and finding solutions. I see it in you. I really do. I saw it in you when I met you on the farm and we walked the land and you talked about the land, and it feels very much like your destiny. So I just wish you all of the best in those pursuits, because I know that you're coming from a place of good. It's like a real deep good within you, and your vision for the future is really beautiful. So thank you so much, V, for speaking with me today. And I hope that everybody who listens to this will go to V Smiley Preserves and check out your amazing products and jams. And actually, in the future, we're going to have them on our shop too. So maybe even when this airs, I'm really excited about that because, like I said, I think I ate a whole jar of your preserves once just out of gluttony. It was just so delicious. It was a pear sage. Is that right?
Now that's hard. Did you eat it just on its own?
Yeah, just kind of
that's hardcore.
Spoonfuls of it. I love pear and I love sage. And so the combination of the two was particularly wonderful. But
that's so cool. I've done that more with like the really fruity, like I did that once with a jar of rhubarb vanilla jam in the spring. And then I know I've done that with a jar of the plum jam for sure. The Cornwall plums. I'm just like, it's like a soft and stew. It's like the Cornwall plums is like soft stewed plums. So it's love it.
They're absolutely delicious flavors. And you can tell that you put so much time, energy, and intention into those flavors. And I love, coming back to earlier in the interview, that it's because food was all of those really wonderful memories that you have of your childhood on that land. So it's kind of about coming full circle. And I just am trying to do better for the next generation of people and community and young farmers. And so I'm rooting for you, V.
Thank you, Alyssa.
Thank you for listening to my conversation with V Smiley. Wow, what an incredible story. I really appreciate V's very intentional planning to create a small business that could be moved back to rural Vermont. I think there are a lot of people out there dreaming of returning to their rural roots, but finding gainful employment or building a business seems daunting or impossible. I hope this story inspires anyone with those same ambitions to dig deep and to see if there's something you can start building as a side hustle that you can eventually move back to your hometown. I also really appreciate V's transitioning from employee to employer and analyzing the systems and culture of the food industry to see where improvements and changes can and should be made. It is only by that analysis that positive improvements can happen. I'm so inspired by V and Amy's vision for the future and their tireless work that they've put into creating a rural destination in New Haven. This will help stimulate the entire local economy. It is extremely difficult to build something from scratch and to find funding when you are one of the first businesses trying to make a unique business model in a rural location. I hope V is able to make the mini factory a reality. And I encourage anyone listening who is a jam or preserves lover to treat yourself to V's incredible lineup of jams. We will be selling V Smiley Preserves on our online shop in the very near future. But until then, you can find links to V Smiley Preserves website, shop, and photos from my 2018 Urban Exodus visit to their home and farm on our blog by visiting urbanexodus.com. Hi, friends. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of the Urban Exodus podcast. Urban Exodus is a labor of love and is only made possible by listener support. I do this work because the people I meet through this project give me energy and hope for the future. My mission is to promote the work of people manifesting good in the world. We are living in a time where there's an overwhelming feeling of dread, and I want this project to encourage people to be proactive and work towards finding creative solutions for both their individual happiness and our collective experience. You can support this work by clicking the support button at the top of urbanexodus.com, by buying an ad spot in an upcoming episode, by shopping our online store, or taking an in-person or online course through our workshops at How Hill Farm. We are also slowly getting our Patreon page together, and we'll be adding bonus features and other content there, so check out patreon.com/urbanexodus to learn more. Another way to support is by giving us a 5-star rating on iTunes and recommending Urban Exodus to your friends. Thank you again for helping me continue to do this work. I couldn't do it without all of you. You can find Urban Exodus on Instagram and Facebook at The Urban Exodus. To read more in-depth features on folks who ditched the city and went country, visit urbanexodus.com. Until next time, I'm Alyssa Hessler, and this is The Urban Exodus.